The forest had always been a forbidden place. Locals spoke of its dense canopy that swallowed sunlight whole, where no bird dared sing, and where the air itself felt alive, charged with an oppressive weight. But the most chilling tales revolved around the whistle. It was said to come from the deepest part of the woods, a long, haunting note that would echo through the trees at dusk. Those who heard it described the sound as eerily human, yet impossibly inhuman at the same time. It wasn't random. It always started soft, like a distant melody carried on the wind, and then grew louder, sharper, more insistent, as if it was zeroing in on you. Some swore it was just the wind. Others said it was something far worse. The elders in the village had a name for it, the voice without an owner. And they all agreed on one thing. If you heard the whistle, never whistle back. But not everyone believed in old stories. That's why Clara found herself standing at the edge of the forest that evening, holding a flashlight in one hand and her phone in the other. The group chat with her friends was blowing up with dares, laughing emojis, and bets. 5 minutes in the woods, Clara. Prove the whistle's just a myth, one message read. Don't chicken out, said another. She smirked, flicking the flashlight on. 5 minutes, she muttered to herself. Easy money. The forest was silent. Not the kind of silence you'd expect in nature. There were no rustling leaves, no chirping crickets, no distant hoots of owls. Just an oppressive stillness that seemed to press against her ears. Every step she took felt deafeningly loud, the crunch of dead leaves underfoot echoing as if the trees themselves were amplifying the sound. She glanced at her phone. 2 minutes had passed. Nothing to worry about. And then she heard it. At first, it was faint, so faint she thought she might have imagined it. A low, wavering note, somewhere between a whistle and a cry, carried on the wind. It came from deeper in the forest. Clara froze. The flashlight trembled slightly in her hand. The sound wasn't constant. It came in bursts like someone was trying to whistle a tune but kept losing their breath. Each note seemed closer than the last, creeping toward her like fingers reaching in the dark. Just the wind, she whispered, though her voice barely carried. She was about to turn back when her phone buzzed in her hand, nearly making her drop it. A message from the group chat. Did you hear that? It's coming from behind you. Her blood turned to ice. Slowly, she turned the flashlight around, aiming it behind her. The beam sliced through the darkness, illuminating nothing but trees, their gnarled branches twisting like skeletal hands. There was no one there. Then the whistle came again, this time directly in her ear. Clara screamed, spinning around wildly. The flashlight flickered, its beam stuttering as if the battery was dying. She backed away, her breaths coming in shallow gasps. The air felt colder now, heavy with a damp, metallic tang that reminded her of blood. Her phone buzzed again. A new message popped up. You shouldn't have come here. She stared at the screen, her hands trembling. The message wasn't from any of her friends. The contact name was just a blank line, and when she tried to reply, the app crashed. The whistle came again, louder, sharper. It wasn't coming from a single direction anymore. It surrounded her, bouncing off the trees, growing more discordant with each passing second. It wasn't a melody anymore. It was a warning. Clara's instincts screamed at her to run, but her legs felt rooted to the spot. The surrounding shadows seemed to move, stretching and curling like living things. And then she saw it, a figure in the distance, just barely illuminated by her flickering flashlight. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that looked stretched, elongated, as though someone had taken a human shape and warped it. Its face, or what she assumed was its face, was featureless, pale, and smooth like porcelain. But the most horrifying thing was its mouth. It was wide, too wide, curving unnaturally from ear to ear. And though the figure had no lips, the sound of whistling poured from that gaping maw like a macabre melody. Clara's scream died in her throat as the figure tilted its head, the whistling stopping abruptly. The silence was worse. She turned and ran, her flashlight clattering to the ground as she bolted blindly through the trees. But the sound followed her. It wasn't a whistle anymore. It was breathing. Wet, rasping breaths that seemed to come from just inches behind her. Her foot caught on something, and she fell hard, the taste of blood filling her mouth as she bit her tongue. She scrambled to get up, but a shadow loomed over her, blotting out what little light remained. And then she felt it, cold, bony fingers brushing against her shoulder. The last thing she heard was the whistle, impossibly loud, as everything went black. Clara's mind was a haze, suspended between fragments of memories and a choking sense of dread. When she finally came to, she wasn't sure how much time had passed. Her head throbbed, and there was a sharp, coppery taste in her mouth. She was lying on cold, damp ground, the smell of rotting leaves clinging to her nostrils. Her flashlight was gone. Her phone, too. She tried to move, but her body felt heavy, as though the surrounding air had thickened into tar. The darkness pressed in on her like a living thing, whispering its secrets in a language she couldn't understand. The only sound was her own ragged breathing, until she realized she wasn't alone. Somewhere in the distance, that haunting whistle began again. This time, it was softer, almost playful, like it was taunting her. Clara's pulse thundered in her ears as she pushed herself up on shaky arms. The forest seemed different now. The trees were closer together, their twisted trunks arching toward her like ribs in a cage. The ground beneath her hands felt wrong, slick and warm, as though she were touching skin instead of earth. She stumbled to her feet, her legs trembling beneath her. "Hello," she called out, her voice breaking. It echoed strangely, as if the forest were mocking her, repeating her fear back to her in distorted tones. The whistle stopped. "Please, whoever's out there," Clara whispered, her voice trembling. "This isn't funny anymore." From the shadows, a voice responded, low and gravelly, as though it hadn't been used in years. "Why did you come here?" She froze, her breath hitching in her throat. The voice had no direction. It was everywhere and nowhere, wrapping around her like a serpent. I didn't mean to," she stammered, backing away blindly. Her foot caught on something, and she fell hard against a tree, the bark digging into her back. She dared to glance down and immediately regretted it. Her flashlight was lying on the ground, its beam flickering weakly. But it wasn't the light that made her stomach churn. It was what the beam illuminated. The roots of the tree weren't roots at all. They were fingers, pale and bony, stretching outward from the earth like they were reaching for her. The tree groaned beneath her weight, the sound wet and organic, and she scrambled away with a strangled cry. The ground shifted beneath her as though it were alive, pulsing and rippling with her every movement. "Why did you whistle back?" the voice hissed again, closer now. "I didn't," Clara cried, tears streaming down her face. But as the words left her mouth, a memory surfaced, sharp and undeniable. She had whistled back once, just once, on a dare back when she was younger, not even thinking about the stories. Her friends had laughed it off, and she had forgotten about it. Until now, the surrounding air grew colder, and the smell of decay thickened, making her gag. A shadow moved just beyond the edge of the flashlight's beam, and Clara's heart seized. "Please," she begged, sinking to her knees. "I didn't mean it. I didn't mean anything." The shadow stepped closer, and she saw it again, the tall, twisted figure with its impossibly wide grin. Its mouth opened, and a sound escaped. Not a whistle this time, but something worse. It was laughter, deep and guttural, like the sound of bones snapping. Clara's body shook as the figure bent down, its face inches from hers. Its hollow eyes seemed to bore into her soul, and for a moment, everything around her fell silent. No whispers, no movement, no breath. Then it spoke again, its voice barely more than a rasp. "You called me here, Clara, and now you'll stay." Before she could scream, the figure reached out with its impossibly long fingers, wrapping them around her wrist. The touch burned like ice, and her vision blurred as pain shot through her body. She tried to fight, to pull away, but the ground beneath her gave way, and she was dragged downward. The earth wasn't solid anymore. It was soft, wet, pulling her in like quicksand. She clawed at the roots and leaves, her nails breaking as she tried to find something, anything, to hold on to. The last thing she saw was the figure, standing over her with that terrible smile, its head tilting in mockery. Then the dirt closed over her, plunging her into total darkness. But it wasn't the end. Clara's consciousness returned in fragments, disjointed and surreal. She wasn't dead, that much she knew, but she wasn't alive either. She was somewhere in between, suspended in a place that felt endless and claustrophobic all at once. She could hear the whispers now, clearer than ever, a cacophony of voices all around her. They told her stories of others who had been dragged here, of the endless torment that awaited them. And then she realized she wasn't alone. The others were there, too, though she couldn't see them. She could feel their presence, their despair pressing down on her like a weight. They had all heard the whistle. They had all made the same mistake. And now, they were part of the forest. Clara opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Only a low, wavering whistle. Time passed, or at least Clara thought it did. In this place, time felt meaningless, stretched thin like a thread about to snap. There was no light, no sense of direction. Just an endless, suffocating darkness and the whispers. They never stopped. At first, they seemed distant, like murmurs in a crowded room. But as the days, or maybe hours, dragged on, they grew louder, clearer, more insistent. Some voices wept, others screamed, and some simply repeated the same chilling phrases over and over. You shouldn't have answered. You'll never leave. The forest feeds on you now. Clara tried to block them out, but they were inside her head, invading her thoughts. She clamped her hands over her ears, but it didn't help. They weren't sounds anymore. They were feelings, emotions seeping into her mind like poison. And then, the worst realization hit her. The whispers weren't coming from outside. They were coming from her. She wasn't sure how long she drifted in that void before something changed. It began as a faint vibration beneath her feet, a pulsing, rhythmic beat, like a distant drum. It grew stronger, shaking the ground until she realized it wasn't a drum at all. It was a heartbeat. The forest was alive. The ground split open beneath her, and Clara fell, tumbling through layers of roots and dirt. Her body hit something hard, and she gasped, air rushing back in her lungs as though she hadn't breathed in years. For a moment, she was blinded by a sickly, greenish glow. When her vision cleared, she found herself in a cavern. The walls pulsed with a fleshy texture, veins glowing faintly with that unnatural green light. The air was thick and humid, reeking of decay. But the worst part was what lay in the center of the cavern. A massive, pulsating mass of flesh and roots writhed like a living heart, its surface covered in twisted faces. They weren't carved or painted. These were real faces, their mouths open in silent screams, their eyes darting wildly as if pleading for help. Clara stumbled backward, her stomach lurching. She recognized some of them. A few were villagers who had disappeared over the years, their faces frozen in eternal agony. Others were strangers, but their expressions told the same story: fear, pain, and despair. The whispers grew louder, echoing through the cavern. Clara clutched her head, tears streaming down her face. "Stop it! Stop it, please!" she screamed, her voice breaking. But the whispers only grew more insistent, overlapping until they became one voice. A deep, guttural rumble that seemed to come from the heart itself. "You belong to me now." Clara turned to run, but the ground beneath her shifted, the fleshy surface rising up to block her path. Roots shot out from the walls, coiling around her ankles and wrists. She screamed, struggling as they dragged her closer to the pulsating heart. "Let me go," she cried, her voice hoarse. The voice laughed, a sound that reverberated through her bones. "You called me, Clara. You whistled. You invited me in. I didn't know," she sobbed. The heart pulsed violently, the faces on its surface twisting and contorting. One of them opened its mouth, and to Clara's horror, it began to whistle. The same haunting melody that had lured her into the forest. The other faces joined in, their dissonant whistles echoing through the cavern until it felt like the sound would split her skull. Suddenly, the roots released her, and she collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. The whistling stopped as abruptly as it had started, replaced by an eerie silence. Clara looked up, and standing before her was the figure. It was different now. Its porcelain face was cracked, revealing patches of raw, pulsing flesh beneath. Its body seemed to ripple, shifting between shapes, sometimes human, sometimes animal, sometimes something completely unrecognizable. But the smile remained, impossibly wide and filled with jagged, blackened teeth. The figure crouched down, its face inches from hers. "Do you know what happens to those who whistle back?" it asked, its voice dripping with mockery. Clara shook her head, too terrified to speak. The figure leaned closer, its breath cold against her skin. "They become part of the forest." Her blood ran cold as she realized what it meant. The faces on the heart, the voices and the whispers, they weren't just victims. They were prisoners, bound to this place for eternity. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, please. I'll do anything." The figure tilted its head, as if considering her words. Then it smiled wider. "Anything?" Clara didn't remember agreeing, but the next thing she knew, she was standing in the forest again. The cavern was gone, replaced by the familiar sight of gnarled trees and dead leaves. The air was cold and still, but it felt heavier somehow, as though the forest was watching her. Her phone lay at her feet, the screen cracked but still glowing. A single message flashed across it. "Your turn?" She picked it up with trembling hands, her heart pounding as she read the words. "What does it mean?" she whispered. Then she heard it, the whistle. It wasn't coming from the forest this time. It was coming from her own lips. Clara tried to stop, but her body moved on its own, her feet carrying her deeper into the woods. The whistle grew louder, echoing through the trees. She realized, with a sickening sense of dread, that she wasn't calling for help. She was calling someone else. The figure's voice echoed in her mind. "You're part of the forest now, Clara, and the forest always needs to feed." Her lips curved into a smile she couldn't control as the sound of footsteps approached from the other side of the trees. Another victim was coming. The footsteps approached, hesitant and cautious, crunching on the brittle, dead leaves. Clara's body moved on its own, stepping between the trees, the whistle slipping from her lips like a melody. She couldn't stop. Her mind screamed for control, but her body was no longer hers. She was a puppet, her strings pulled by the forest, by the figure, by the pulsating heart buried deep beneath the ground. The victim emerged into view, a young man, maybe in his early 20s. His phone's flashlight cut weakly through the darkness, the beam flickering as if it, too, were afraid of this place. His wide eyes darted between the shadows, his breath quick and shallow. Clara saw his lips move, but no sound reached her. It was as though the forest had swallowed his voice. He stopped, his gaze locking onto her. "Hello," he called, his voice shaky. Is someone there?" Clara wanted to scream at him, to warn him, to tell him to run. But her body betrayed her. Instead of words, the whistle poured from her lips again, long and low, curling through the air like a thread wrapping around the man's throat. His face twisted with fear, but he didn't run. The whistle always had that effect. It drew people in, paralyzed them with a mix of dread and curiosity. "Please," Clara thought, her mind a storm of desperation. "Don't come closer." But the man took a step forward, his hand shaking as he raised his phone. The light illuminated Clara's face, and for a moment, she saw hope flicker in his eyes. "Are you okay?" he asked. "Are you hurt?" Clara's smile widened against her will, the expression stretching unnaturally across her face. Her head tilted, her movements jerky and wrong, like a marionette controlled by clumsy hands. She took a step toward him, her bare feet silent on the forest floor. The man's hope faltered, replaced by unease. He took a step back, his flashlight trembling. What's wrong with you?" Behind Clara, the forest came alive. Shadows twisted and shifted, the trees creaking as their gnarled branches reached toward him like skeletal fingers. The air grew colder, the smell of decay thickening. The man stumbled, his phone slipping from his hand and landing with a dull thud. He turned to run, but the roots surged up from the ground, coiling around his ankles like snakes. He fell hard, his screams muffled as the forest seemed to absorb the sound. Clara's mind reeled as her body moved closer, bending down until she was crouched over him. Her hand reached out, fingers brushing his cheek. His skin was warm, alive. A pang of sorrow shot through her, but it was drowned out by the forest's hunger. The man's terrified eyes locked onto hers. "Help me," he whispered. Her hand gripped his throat. As the forest consumed him, Clara felt everything. His fear, his pain, his final moments of desperation. They all surged through her like fire, burning away the last remnants of who she had been. When it was over, the forest fell silent again, the air heavy with its satisfaction. The man was gone, his body absorbed into the earth, his face now one of many on the heart beneath the ground. Clara stood, her body trembling. For a brief moment, she thought she might collapse, that the weight of what she had done would crush her. But instead, a strange calm settled over her. The forest whispered to her, its voice soothing, promising her release from the guilt, from the pain. "You belong here now," it said. "You are one of us." And Clara felt it. She felt the roots beneath her feet, the pulse of the heart deep below. She was no longer just a part of the forest. The forest was part of her. The stories spread, as they always did. Tales of the whistle in the woods, of the people who vanished without a trace. Some dismissed them as myths, while others whispered warnings to their children. Never go into the forest. And if you hear the whistle, don't answer it. But curiosity is a powerful thing, and the forest knows it well. One autumn evening, a group of teenagers gathered at the edge of the woods, their phones out, their laughter masking their nervousness. They dared each other to enter, to prove the stories were just that, stories. They didn't notice the figure watching them from the shadows, her pale face glowing faintly in the moonlight. She looked human enough, but there was something off about her. Something in the way she moved, the way her head tilted too far to one side, the way her smile stretched unnaturally wide. She raised her head and began to whistle. It was soft at first, barely audible over the rustling leaves. But it grew louder, more insistent, weaving its way through the trees, drawing the teenagers closer. As they stepped into the forest, one by one, the figure's smile widened. The forest was hungry again, and Clara had become its most faithful servant. And deep beneath the ground, the heart pulsed with anticipation.